The galaxy was old, and it had seen the rise and fall of 10,000 civilizations before humanity ever crawled out of its caves and looked up at the stars. In the year 2387 by the human calendar, the species known as Homo sapiens had managed to spread itself across 14 colony worlds, a modest accomplishment by galactic standards, the kind of thing the elder races noted in their records and then promptly forgot about. The Galactic Concord, that vast alliance of over 200 spacefaring species, had a system for ranking civilizations, and it was not a kind system, not for the newcomers at least. And humanity sat at the very bottom of that ranking, at Tier 9, a classification that meant passive, harmless, young, and militarily negligible, the sort of species you did not invite to the important meetings, because they had nothing worth hearing and nothing worth taking. Admiral Lena Vasquez knew this better than anyone. She stood on the bridge of the UHS Carthage, flagship of Earth's colonial defense fleet, and she stared at the tactical display with the kind of calm that came not from confidence, but from the deep and permanent understanding that her fleet of 92 ships was a joke compared to what was out there in the black. Vasquez was 53 years old, with silver streaking through her dark hair, and lines around her eyes that came from years of staring at screens and swallowing the kind of frustration that could eat a person alive from the inside, because she had spent her entire career knowing that everything she commanded, every ship, every weapon, every soldier under her authority, could be swept away in an afternoon by any one of a dozen alien empires who would not even consider it a real battle. But she kept her fleet sharp anyway, because that was what you did when you were small and surrounded by giants. You stayed ready, and you stayed quiet, and you prayed that nobody ever looked your way with hungry. Ambassador Idris Okonkwo was the man whose job it was to make sure nobody ever did. He was humanity's representative to the Galactic Concord, a tall and elegant man with a voice like warm honey, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, because behind that smile was a mind that had spent 26 years navigating the most dangerous game in the galaxy, which was not war, but diplomacy among species who considered you furniture. Okonkwo had learned to bow without breaking, to smile while being insulted, to thank beings who looked at him like he was an animal that had somehow learned to talk. And he did all of this because every day that humanity was ignored was a day that humanity survived. Then the Velari Dominion decided to stop ignoring them. The Velari were reptilian in the loosest sense of the word, towering creatures covered in scales, the color of dark iron, with eyes like molten copper and jaws that could crush stone, conquering their way across the galaxy for longer than humanity had been using fire. Their empire spanned 4,000 worlds, and their military was the kind of force that made other empires go quiet when it entered a room, not out of respect, but out of the pure animal recognition of something that could kill you and would not hesitate to do so. At the head of this empire sat Archon Jacques, ancient and cold, and utterly certain of his place at the top of every food chain that had ever existed. When the long-range survey ships discovered a belt of rare minerals in the outer sectors, a belt worth more than most civilizations would produce in a century, Jacques barely glanced at the territorial maps before issuing the order, because the belt overlapped with a small and unimportant human colony called Elysium 4, and small and unimportant things had never slowed the Dominion before. The displacement edict arrived at Earth like a death sentence wrapped in legal language. It gave humanity 30 galactic cycles to evacuate 1.2 million colonists from Elysium 4, or face what the document called corrective military action, which was the Velari way of saying they would burn every man, woman, and child on that planet to ash, and then mine the ground where they had stood. Ambassador Okonkwo read the edict 3 times, and then he did what he had always done. He went to the Galactic Concord, and he asked for help. The Chamber of the Concord was a vast and ancient place, a cathedral of alien architecture, where representatives of 200 species sat in tiered rows that stretched up into a ceiling, lost in shadow. And Okonkwo stood at the center of it all, a single human in a room full of beings who had been traveling the stars when his ancestors were still figuring out bronze. He made his case with everything he had, with facts and with law, and with the kind of quiet, desperate dignity that should have moved even then. Coldest heart in the galaxy. The elder species listened. They nodded their various heads, and clicked their various mandibles, and blinked their various eyes. And then they did nothing. Not one species spoke in humanity's defense. Not one vote was cast. Not one hand or claw or tentacle was raised. Because the Velthari were powerful, and humanity was not, and the math of galactic politics was as simple and as cruel as it had ever been. Okonkwo walked out of that chamber with his back straight and his face composed, and his heart full of a rage so deep and so quiet that it frightened even him. He sent one message to Admiral Vasquez, just 2 words, and those 2 words changed everything. They refused. Vasquez read the message, and she closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, she let go of every hope she had ever held that the galaxy would treat humanity with fairness. And when she opened her eyes again, they were clear, and hard, and ready. She activated Doctrine Blackthorne. It was not a battle plan, not in any way that the galaxy would have recognized, because humanity had never been foolish enough to plan for a fair fight. Humanity had planned for the fight it knew it would actually get, which was the kind where you were smaller and weaker and outnumbered, and the only thing you had on your side was the willingness to do whatever it took to survive. The colonial defense fleet began to move, not toward Elysium 4, but into the dark spaces between stars, into asteroid fields and nebulae, and all the places where small things could hide and wait and prepare. On Elysium 4, the colonists were not told to panic. They were told to pack, but not to leave, not yet, because leaving was what the Velthari expected, and Admiral Vasquez had decided that the Velthari were going to learn a very old and very human lesson about the difference between expectation and reality. In the Iron Throne Room of the Velthari homeworld, a junior officer brought Archon Shakran the report that the humans had refused to evacuate. Shakran was reviewing fleet deployments for a border conflict with a species that actually mattered when the officer delivered the news. And the Archon did not look up, did not pause, did not for even a fraction of a moment consider that this information was worth his full attention. He simply flicked one clawed hand in the gesture that meant approval, and spoke in a voice that carried no more emotion than if he had been ordering his evening meal. Mobilize the 9th Conquest Fleet. Log it as a minor pacification action. It should take no more than a single rotation. The officer bowed and left. Shakran returned to his work. He did not know it yet. None of them did, but that casual flick of his hand had just triggered a war against the deadliest species in existence. And by the time he understood what that meant, it would be far too late to take it back. The 9th Conquest Fleet of the Veltari Dominion dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Elysium system, like a wall of iron descending from the heavens. 800 warships, each one bristling with weapons that could crack continents, arranged in the perfect formation that had broken 63 civilizations before this one. And at the center of that formation sat the dreadnought Wrath of Velcars, a ship so massive it had its own gravitational pull, a floating fortress that served as the command throne of Fleet Commander Rothan Vel. Rothan Vel was not worried. He was a veteran of 37 conquest campaigns, and he had never lost a single one. Not against the crystalline hive minds of the Sethari cluster, not against the psychic warlords of the Nintok expanse, not against anyone. And he was certainly not going to lose to a species that the Concord had classified as Tier 9, a designation that meant these creatures were barely worth the ammunition it would take to kill them. He gave the order to advance toward Elysium 4 in standard conquest formation, shields at minimum, because there was no point wasting energy against an enemy that could not scratch his hull, and the fleet moved inward like a slow and terrible tide. The first thing Rothenfell noticed was the silence. There were no distress calls from the planet, no panic transmissions, no civilian ships fleeing in every direction the way they always did when the Dominion arrived. There was nothing, just the cold quiet of empty space, and that silence was the first thing that made the scales on the back of his neck prickle in a way he did not like. The second thing he noticed was that the orbital stations around Elysium 4 were dark, powered down, and seemingly abandoned, drifting in their orbits like dead things. The third thing he noticed was the mines. They detonated in a cascading wave that tore through the forward elements of his fleet like a fist through glass. And they were not ordinary mines. They were smart, adaptive, patient little machines that had been sitting in the dark for weeks, hidden among asteroid debris and space junk, waiting for exactly this moment. And they did not just explode, they targeted engines and shield generators with a precision that spoke of someone who had studied Velari ship designs very carefully. 41 ships died in the first 90 seconds. Rothenfell roared orders to raise shields and scatter into defensive positions, and his fleet responded with the discipline of a professional military that had been doing this for centuries. But even as they reformed, the second wave hit. They came out of nowhere. Small ships, impossibly small by Veltari standards, painted black and running without any energy signatures that the Dominion sensors could detect. And they struck like ghosts, firing volleys of precision missiles into the gaps between shields, and then vanishing back into the dark before anyone could return fire. Captain Jericho Tanaka, the man his crew called Ghost, sat in the command chair of the stealth frigate Pale Horse, and watched 3 Veltari destroyers break apart on his tactical display, with the calm focus of a surgeon performing an operation. Tanaka was 41 years old, and he had spent the last 15 of those years in the Black Operations Division of the Colonial Defense Fleet, doing the kind of work that never appeared in any official record, the kind of work that taught you how to kill things much bigger than you, and how to disappear before they could kill you back. He was very good at his job. "Fire Package 7, he said, and his weapons officer sent a spread of micro-torpedoes into the engine section of a Veltari cruiser, and the cruiser shuddered and went dark and began to drift, and the Pale Horse was already gone, sliding back into the sensor shadow of a nearby asteroid like a knife sliding back into its sheath. Across the battlespace, 23 other human stealth frigates were doing the same thing, appearing and striking and vanishing in a pattern that was not random, but was designed to look random, because the humans had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do to an enemy was not hurt them, but confuse them. Rothenfell was confused. He had fought enemies who were stronger than him, and enemies who were faster than him, and enemies who outnumbered him, but he had never fought an enemy he could not find. And every time his sensors locked onto one of the human ships, it simply was not there anymore. And then another part of his fleet would erupt in fire, and the cycle would begin again. 6 hours into the engagement, he had lost 35 ships, and he had not destroyed a single human vessel, not one. And the rage building inside him was beginning to be overtaken by something colder and more dangerous. Was the first faint stirring of doubt. Then his supply convoy arrived at the designated coordinates and found nothing but debris. The humans had hit it too. An ambush laid days in advance by automated drones hidden in an asteroid field 3 light minutes away. Drones that had waited in perfect silence until the convoy appeared, and then swarmed it with the mindless, hungry efficiency of insects. And now the 9th Conquest Fleet was cut off from resupply in hostile territory with an enemy it could not see and could not catch. Rothenvel was a proud creature, but he was not a stupid one, and he recognized the shape of what was happening to him, because it was something the Veltari had done to others many times before. He was being hunted, not fought, hunted, and that realization sat in his stomach like a stone. He ordered a full sensor sweep of the entire system, maximum power, and he found them. Or at least he found one of them, a single human frigate that had been forced out of stealth by a lucky sensor hit, and he sent 6 ships to run it down and destroy it. The human frigate was the UHS Defiant, and when its captain realized there was no escape, she did not surrender. She did not run. She did not beg for mercy on any channel. Instead, she turned her ship directly toward the largest of the 6 Velthari vessels, a heavy cruiser 300 times her tonnage. And she pushed her engines to maximum, and she overloaded her reactor core. And she drove the Defiant straight into the cruiser's heart, like a burning spear. The explosion consumed both ships entirely, and damaged 2 others so badly they had to be abandoned. Rothenvel stared at his display, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. A crawling sensation along his spine that his species had not needed for millennia, but had never fully lost. The ancient instinct that said, "You are not the predator here." He composed a priority message to the Dominion. Command, and he chose his words carefully, because he knew how they would sound, and he knew the shame they would bring him. But he sent them anyway, because the truth mattered more than pride. These creatures do not fight like a Tier 9 species. They fight like cornered predators with nothing left to lose. They learn from every engagement, and they adapt faster than any enemy I have faced. They would rather destroy themselves than allow us a victory. I am requesting immediate reinforcements and a reassessment of the threat classification. This is not a pacification action. This is a war. The message traveled across the stars, and it reached the Galactic Concord before it reached the Velthari homeworld, because the Concord monitored all military communications in contested space, and it landed on the desk of a quiet intelligence analyst in a quiet office on a quiet station, and that analyst read it twice. Then she opened humanity's file in the Concord's master database, file that had not been updated in decades, because nobody had ever considered it worth updating. And she looked at the threat classification that read Tier 9 Passive Civilization, and she selected it, and she deleted it. She stared at the blank field for a long time. She tried several other classifications, but none of them fit, because the existing system had been designed for species that behaved in predictable ways. Species that surrendered when outmatched, or fled when outgunned, or negotiated when cornered, and the humans were doing none of those things. The humans were doing something the system had no category for. She left the field blank, and added a single note that read, "Pending review, no existing classification adequate." Then she closed the file and sat back in her chair, and for the first time in her long career, she felt genuinely afraid. Not of the Velthari. She had never been afraid of the Velthari. Everyone understood the Velthari. She was afraid of the humans. Because the Veltari were predictable in their violence, they conquered, and they consumed, and they moved on. And you could map their behavior, and plan for it, and survive it, if you were careful. But the humans were something else entirely. Something that smiled and traded, and built schools for their children, and wrote poetry, and made music, and then when you pushed them, when you threatened what they loved, they became something that was willing to fly a ship into a wall of fire, just to take you with them. And she did not know how you planned for that. Nobody did. The Velthari did not make small mistakes, and they did not make the same mistake twice. So when Archon Jacqueline received Rothenvel's message, he did not dismiss it. He read it carefully, and then he did what the Velthari had always done when something refused to die easily. He sent a force so large that survival was not a possibility. The Third Grand Armada was the kind of military formation that did not just win battles, but ended civilizations. 12,000 warships, crewed by millions of Velari warriors, supported by orbital bombardment platforms and siege carriers, and things that did not have names in any human language, because no human had ever needed a word for a weapon designed to kill a planet. It moved toward human space like a slow avalanche, and the galaxy watched. They all watched now. In the halls of the Galactic Concord, species that had not spoken to each other in centuries leaned close and whispered, because something was happening that had never happened before. Never happened before. A Tier 9 species had bloodied the Velari, and the universe suddenly felt less predictable than it had the day before. The Concord dispatched an observer. Her name was Siluun, and she was Kathari, a member of one of the oldest species in the known galaxy, insectoid beings with iridescent shells and compound eyes that saw in spectrums most creatures could not imagine. And the Kathari had been watching younger species rise and fall for so long that they had developed a kind of patient detachment about the whole business, the way a mountain might feel about the weather. Siluun's assignment was simple in theory. She was to assess whether humanity represented a broader threat to galactic stability, a question that would have seemed absurd 6 months ago, and now seemed like the most important question anyone had ever asked. She began with the obvious. She reviewed the military engagement data from Elysium, and what she found there was troubling, but not unprecedented. Smaller forces had occasionally surprised larger ones through cleverness and terrain advantage. That was not new. What was new was what she found when she went deeper. Siluun requested access to Earth's historical and cultural archives, a request that was granted immediately because the humans had nothing to hide, and perhaps because they wanted someone, anyone, to actually look at who they were instead of just assuming they were nothing. She started reading, and she did not stop for 3 days. On the first day she read about the wars. Not the human-alien conflicts, those were recent and brief, but the wars humans had fought against each other, thousands upon thousands of them, stretching back to the very beginning of their recorded history. Wars fought over land and resources, and religion, and pride, and revenge, and sometimes for reasons so tangled that even the humans themselves could not fully explain them. A place called Stalingrad, where humans had fought each other building by building, room by room, in conditions so terrible that soldiers froze to death in the night, and their comrades used their bodies as barriers against the cold, and then kept fighting in the morning. She read about a small country called Vietnam, where a technologically inferior force had fought the most powerful military on their planet to a standstill, through sheer endurance and the willingness to absorb casualties that would have broken any other species. She read about a fortress called Masada, where 900 humans had chosen to die by their own hands rather than submit to capture, and about a city called Warsaw, where people trapped behind walls had risen up against an overwhelming enemy with homemade weapons, because they had decided that dying on their feet was better than living on their knees. On the second day, she read about the planet itself. Earth was what the galactic classification system called a Category 12 Death World, a designation that was supposed to be theoretical because nobody had believed a sapient species could actually evolve on a world that hostile. A world with active tectonic plates that rearranged entire continents, with a magnetic field that was slowly weakening, with a star that bombarded the surface with radiation, with a climate so unstable it swung between ice ages and greenhouse events on a geological whim, with an ecosystem so competitive that 99% of every species that had ever lived there had gone extinct. And humans had not just survived on this world, they had conquered it. They had hunted their own apex predators to extinction, not because they needed to, but because those predators had threatened their young, and humans had decided that anything that threatened their young did not get to exist anymore. They had survived ice ages by wrapping themselves in the skins of dead animals, and burning things, and Refusing to die, they had crossed oceans on boats made of wood. They had climbed mountains that killed them just to prove they could. They had invented agriculture and medicine and nuclear weapons and spaceflight. And they had done all of it in a geological eye blink, faster than any species in the Concorde's records. On the third day, Siluun stopped reading and sat very still for a long time. Then she requested an emergency session of the Concorde's Security Council. The chamber was full, every seat taken, because word had spread that the Kathari observer had something to say about the humans, and everyone wanted to hear it. Some out of curiosity, and some out of fear, and some because they had already begun to suspect what Siluun was about to confirm. She stood at the center of the chamber, and her voice was calm and precise, and carried the weight of a species that had been watching the galaxy for longer than most of the civilizations in that room had existed. "Have made a catastrophic error in classification," she began, and the chamber went very quiet. This species did not evolve as prey. It did not develop sapience as a survival mechanism against predators, the way the Velthari did. It did not evolve as a herd animal seeking safety in numbers, like the Tarathi. It did not arise as builders or philosophers, or any of the other archetypes in our taxonomy. She paused, and every eye and lens and sensor in the room was fixed on her. Humans evolved as pursuit predators on a world that tried to kill them every single day of their existence. They are endurance hunters, a strategy so energy-intensive and so dangerous that almost no other species in the galaxy has ever attempted it. They do not chase their prey because they are faster. They chase it because they never stop. They follow it until it collapses from exhaustion, and then they kill it. And they have applied this same strategy to every challenge they have ever faced. Every trait we dismissed, their adaptability, their aggression, their tolerance for pain, their ability to bond with anything, including species not their own, their willingness to sacrifice individual members for the survival of the group. These are not the traits of a Tier 9 civilization. These are the traits of the most dangerous organism this galaxy has ever produced. They were simply never provoked until now. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the Velthari ambassador stood and called her assessment hysterical, and demanded that the Concorde authorize joint action against humanity before they became a genuine threat. And several species who had always followed the Velthari's lead murmured in agreement. But others did not murmur. Others sat very still and looked at the data Siluun had projected onto the chamber's displays. The casualty figures from Elysium, the historical records of human conflict, the biological specifications of a species that could run for days without stopping, that could heal from wounds that would kill most galactic species, that could function without sleep for extended periods, that could eat almost anything organic, that could survive temperature ranges that would be lethal to 90% of known sapient life. Meanwhile, the Third Grand Armada reached Elysium 4 and took it by force. 12,000 ships against a token defense force, and the Veltari declared victory and landed their troops, expecting to process prisoners and begin mining operations. They found no prisoners. The colonists were gone, all 1.2 million of them, evacuated through a network of routes so carefully hidden that Veltari intelligence had not detected a single one, moved to safety weeks before the Armada arrived. What the Veltari troops found instead was a world that had been turned into a trap. Every building was rigged, every tunnel was a kill zone, every piece of abandoned infrastructure concealed something designed to maim and destroy. And the human resistance fighters who had stayed behind, volunteers every one of them, fought from the shadows with a creativity and violence that horrified even the Velthari. And above the planet, Dr. Eris Mensa watched from a hidden relay station as the data poured in, data that would feed the final calibrations of Project Prometheus, humanity's answer to the question of how you fight an empire with 4,000 worlds. The answer, it turned out, was that you build something that eats their ships alive. The first Prometheus swarm was deployed against a Velthari supply convoy 3 weeks later. Billions of nanoscopic machines that attached to hull plating and disassembled it molecule by molecule, turning warships into expanding clouds of raw atoms in a matter of hours. The Velthari had never seen anything like it. Nobody had. And somewhere in his Iron Throne room, Archon, Jacqueline, stared at casualty projections that climbed higher every day. And for the first time in his 300-year reign, he felt something cold and unfamiliar moving through him. Something he had only ever seen in the eyes of the species he had conquered. It took him a long moment to recognize it as dread. 6 months into the war, and the galaxy had stopped pretending it was not watching. Every intelligence service on every civilized world had analysts dedicated to what they were now calling the human-Velthari conflict, a name that would have been laughable half a year ago, because nobody would have put those two species in the same sentence. It would have been like comparing a campfire to a star, except the campfire had somehow set the star on fire, and now nobody knew what to believe anymore. Admiral Lena Vasquez stood in the war room of Bastion Station, humanity's hidden military command buried deep inside a hollowed-out asteroid in a system that did not appear on any galactic chart. And she studied the strategic display with the focus of a woman who had not slept more than 4 hours a night in 6 months, and who had no intention of sleeping more than that until this was over. The display showed something that would have been impossible to imagine when this started. Humanity was winning. Not in the way the Velthari won, not through overwhelming force and brute dominance, but in the way that water wins against rock, slowly and persistently, and by finding every crack and exploiting it until the whole structure began to crumble. The humans had done what no Tier 9 species should have been capable of doing. They had captured Velthari technology, and they had taken it apart, and they had understood it, and then they had made it better. Because that was what humans did. They looked at something that was meant to kill them, and they turned it into something that killed the thing that made it. Velthari shield harmonics had been a closely guarded military secret for 8 centuries, and human engineers had cracked them in 11 weeks, working in shifts around the clock in underground labs, fueled by caffeine and desperation, and the particular kind of stubborn genius that only emerged when an entire species had its back against it. The wall. Veltari FTL drives operated on principles that most galactic species considered too dangerous to modify, but human physicists had looked at those principles and seen not danger, but opportunity, and they had developed a modification that allowed short-range tactical jumps, the ability to appear behind an enemy formation and fire, and then vanish before the enemy could turn around. A capability that the Veltari had never needed to defend against, because nobody had ever been reckless enough to try it. And the new ships, the ones coming out of humanity's hidden shipyards in the deep outer systems, were not copies of anything the galaxy had seen before. They were something new, built from the ground up by a species that had been studying the way the Veltari fought, and had designed every hull plate and every weapon system and every engine specifically to counter it. The Veltari fought like conquerors, with massive ships and overwhelming firepower, and the assumption that their enemy would stand and face them or break and run. The humans built ships that did neither, ships that were fast and vicious and worked in coordinated packs, like the wolves their ancestors had once hunted beside. Ships that struck at weak points with surgical precision and then scattered into the dark before the counterattack arrived. Vasquez looked at the display, and she allowed herself a small, hard smile that contained no joy, only determination. And then she gave the order she had been planning for 3 months. Execute Operation Harrow. 3 human fleets, each one a fraction of the size of the Velthari forces they targeted, hit 3 separate Velthari military shipyards simultaneously in 3 different star systems, and the coordination was so precise that the first missiles struck all 3 targets within 4 seconds of each other, despite the targets being light years apart. The shipyards were among the most heavily defended installations in the Dominion, protected by orbital fortresses and minefields and patrol fleets, and the humans went through all of it in 4 hours. Captain Tanaka and the Pale Horse led the assault on the largest shipyard, a facility the size of a small moon that produced the Dominion's heaviest warships. And he threaded his stealth fleet through the defense grid like smoke through a fence, and delivered Prometheus payloads directly onto the shipyard's hull, and then pulled back and watched as the nanoscale machines did their work, eating the station from the outside in, while the Velthari crew scrambled to stop a threat they could not see and could not fight. By the time the Velthari patrol fleet arrived, the shipyard was a cloud of dissolving metal, and the human ships were already gone. When the reports reached Archon Chakren, he did something that no Velthari Archon had done in the entire history of the Dominion. He asked for help. Galactic Concord, this ancient and terrible ruler of 4,000 worlds, and he called humanity a destabilizing existential threat to galactic order, and he demanded, not asked, but demanded, that the Concord intervene militarily to contain them before they grew too powerful to stop. Ambassador Okonkwo was ready. He stood in the same chamber where he had begged for help 6 months ago and received nothing. And this time he did not beg. This time he spoke with the quiet authority of a man who represented a species that had proven it could not be ignored. The Veltari issued a displacement edict against a peaceful human colony, he said, and his voice carried to every corner of that vast room. They threatened to murder 1.2 million civilians if we did not abandon our own world. We brought this injustice to the Concord, and the Concord did nothing. Not one species spoke for us. Not one vote was cast in our defense. And now the Veltari stand before you and ask you to punish us for having the audacity to survive. He paused and looked around the chamber at 200 species who were all suddenly very interested in the floor. We did not start this war. We will not apologize for refusing to die in it. The Concord fractured. Some of the elder species, particularly those who had always aligned with the Veltari out of fear, voted for intervention, arguing that humanity's rapid technological advancement was dangerous and needed to be contained before it upset the balance of power. But others broke ranks. The Tarathi, a gentle herbivorous species that had endured Veltari border raids for generations, quietly opened their supply routes to human ships and pretended not to notice. The Kathari shared intelligence about Veltari fleet movements through channels so backdoor that they officially did not exist. And a dozen smaller species, who had spent centuries living in the shadow of the Dominion, began sending resources and engineers and offers of alliance to Earth. The galaxy was realigning, and at the center of that realignment was a species that had been classified as Tier 9, harmless, negligible, not worth the attention of the powerful. The Veltari saw their position crumbling, and Chakren made the decision that would define the rest of the war. The decision that even those who had defended him would later call his greatest mistake. He ordered the deployment of a planet cracker. The weapon was ancient even by Veltari standards, a device designed to fracture a world's mantle and render it uninhabitable. And it had been used only twice before in the Dominion's history, both times against species that had been erased so thoroughly that even their names were forgotten. The target was Meridian 7, a human colony of 400,000 people, a world of farms and schools and hospitals and children who had never heard a gunshot, chosen specifically because it had no military value, because the point was not strategy, the point was terror. The point was to show humanity what happened to species that defied the Dominion. The weapon fired, and Meridian 7 died. 400,000 lives ended in minutes, the planet's surface cracking open like an egg, oceans boiling into the atmosphere, cities crumbling into chasms of molten rock, and the screams that went out over the emergency channels before the communication arrays melted were heard by every species in the galaxy, because the Velthari made sure of it. They wanted everyone to hear. They wanted everyone to be afraid. They got their wish, but not in the way they intended. Because humanity did not break. Humanity did not scatter, or surrender, or collapse into grief, though the grief was there, deep and vast and terrible, a wound that would never fully heal. What humanity did was something far more dangerous. It unified. Every faction, every political division, every argument and disagreement that had ever existed within the human species evaporated overnight, like dew under a nuclear sun. And what was left was a single unified will pointed at the Veltari Dominion like a blade. Admiral Vasquez stood before the United Human Assembly, the emergency governing body that had been formed when the war began. And behind her, the screens showed Meridian 7, what was left of it. A broken world wreathed in fire, and every representative in that room had tears on their face, or fury in their eyes, or both. Vasquez spoke, and her voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that was more frightening than any shout, the quiet of someone who had moved past rage into something colder and harder and infinitely more dangerous. They wanted to teach us fear, she said. Instead, they have taught us that mercy is a luxury we can no longer afford. The assembly voted unanimously. Total war. And across the galaxy, species who had known the Velthari for millennia felt something shift in the fabric of things, something fundamental and irreversible, because the humans were no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting for vengeance. And that, as the Kathari had tried to warn everyone, was something else entirely. 1 year after the Veltari Dominion issued a displacement edict against a small and unimportant human colony, Archon Jacqueline stood in his war room and stared at a strategic display that would have been unthinkable 12 months ago. The Dominion was losing. Not slowly, not gradually, not in the way that empires usually declined over centuries of soft decay, but rapidly and violently, the way a building collapses when someone removes the supports. One day it is standing, and the next it is rubble, and the rubble is on fire. Humanity had done something that violated every model of warfare the galaxy had ever known. They had taken every blow the Veltari delivered, and instead of weakening, they had grown stronger. Every loss had made them angrier. Every defeat had made them smarter. Every atrocity had made them more united. And the destruction of Meridian 7 had not broken them. It had forged them into something that even Jacqueline, with all his centuries of conquest, could not comprehend, had never faced before. An enemy that could not be intimidated, because they had already lost the worst thing they could lose. An enemy that could not be exhausted, because their biology was built for endurance beyond anything the galaxy had seen. An enemy that could not be outsmarted, because they learned and adapted faster than any species in recorded history. Admiral Vasquez launched Operation Omega Dawn on a Tuesday by the human calendar. Not because Tuesday had any strategic significance, but because the planning was complete and the fleets were in position, and Vasquez was not the kind of person who waited for symbolic moments when there was work to be done. 47 human fleets moved simultaneously across a front that spanned hundreds of light years, each fleet supported by ships from allied species who had broken with the Concord's neutrality. The Torathi with their massive cargo vessels converted into carriers, the Kathari with their ancient and terrifyingly advanced electronic warfare platforms, the Dranasi with their fast attack corvettes, and a dozen others who had decided that the Velthari's reign had lasted long enough, and that the humans were the blade that could finally cut it short. The operation was not designed to conquer the Dominion. Vasquez had no interest in ruling 4,000 worlds. It was designed to break the Dominion's ability to wage war, to smash its military infrastructure so completely that it could never again threaten anyone, to teach a lesson that would echo through galactic history for as long as there was a galaxy to remember it. The Velthari fought back with everything they had, and what they had was still formidable. Thousands of warships crewed by warriors who had never known defeat until a year ago, and who burned with shame and fury at what the humans had done to them. But the humans had spent a year learning how the Velthari fought, studying their tactics, and their psychology, and their culture. And they had designed Operation Omega Dawn not just as a military campaign, but as a psychological one. Every strike calculated not just to destroy, but to demoralize. Every victory broadcast on every channel, so that the Velthari fleet could watch their empire crumble in real time. One by one, the Dominion's forward bases fell. Then its supply depots, then its communication relays, and the great armada that Jacques Ren had assembled began to fragment, as individual fleet commanders lost contact with each other and with command. And in the gaps between those fragments, the human wolf packs hunted. Captain Tanaka and the Pale Horse led a strike group of stealth frigates through the Velthari's inner defense perimeter, slipping past sensor nets and patrol routes with the silent precision that had earned Tanaka his name. And behind him came the main assault fleet, pouring through the hole he had cut like water through a broken dam. Everything back to the throne world, Velcarsis, heart of the Dominion, a world that had never been attacked in 4,000 years of Imperial history, a planet ringed with orbital fortresses and defense platforms, and the massed remnants of every fleet the Dominion could still field. And Jacques Ren stood at the center of it all, and prepared to make his final stand, because he was many things, but he was not a coward. And if his empire was going to fall, it would fall fighting. The Battle of Velcarsis was the largest single engagement the galaxy had ever witnessed. The human and allied fleet numbered over 6,000 ships against the Dominion's 8,000, and by every traditional measure of military science, the defenders should have won. They had numerical superiority, and they had fortified positions, and they were fighting for their homeworld. Every advantage that had ever mattered in the history of warfare. But the humans did not fight the way military science said they should. They fought like humans. The battle opened with Prometheus swarms launched from long range, clouds of nanoscopic machines that descended on the orbital fortresses like invisible locusts and began eating them alive. And while the Veltari scrambled to counter a threat they still had not fully learned to fight, the human fleets hit them from 3 directions at once in a coordinated assault so complex that Veltari tactical analysts would later say it should have been impossible to execute in real time. Human ships fought with a ferocity that stunned even their allies, crews pushing their vessels past every safety limit, pilots executing maneuvers that the shipboard computers flagged as suicidal, captains ramming crippled ships into enemy formations rather than retreat, because retreat was not in the vocabulary of a species that had decided this war would end here and now. The Marines were worse. Human soldiers in powered armor breached Veltari dreadnoughts hull to hull, cutting through armor plating with plasma torches and then fighting their way inside, deck by deck, corridor by corridor, in close-quarters combat so brutal that Veltari warriors who had never known fear learned it in the time it took a human to cross a room. The Veltari were bigger and stronger, and their scales could turn a blade. But the humans were faster, and they never stopped coming, and they fought with a controlled savagery that was more terrifying than mindless rage, because there was intelligence behind it, calculation, the cold, clear thinking of a predator that knew exactly where to bite. Tanaka brought the Pale Horse through the orbital defense grid in what the after-action reports would later call the single most insane act of piloting in naval history. Threading through a gap in the fortress network that was barely wider than his ship, taking fire from 6 different platforms simultaneously, his hull burning and his shields failing, and his crew holding on to anything bolted down as the ship bucked and shuddered through a corridor of fire. He delivered the Prometheus payload directly onto the planetary shield generator, a target buried beneath layers of armor and redundant systems. And the nanoscale machines ate through all of it in 11 minutes, and the shield fell, and Velcars lay open to the sky for the first time in millennia. Tanaka survived, barely, his ship limping away from the generator with half its systems destroyed and fires burning on 3 decks. And when his crew pulled him from the command chair, he was bleeding from a head wound and grinning. And the first thing he said was, "Someone tell the Admiral the door is open." Vasquez received the message, and she gave the final order. And the human fleet descended on Velcars, not to destroy it, because Vasquez had never wanted to destroy anyone, but to surround it so completely that the Dominion could not escape and could not fight, and could only do the one thing that Jacques had never done in his 300 years of life: surrender. The Archon stood in his throne room as the reports came in, fortress after fortress going silent, fleet after fleet being shattered or captured. And around him, his advisors and generals stood in the rigid silence of beings who were watching the impossible happen. He had a choice, and he knew it. He could fight to the last ship and the last soldier and take the human fleet with him, because even now the Dominion had enough firepower to make the victory a Pyrrhic one. Or he could do the thing that every bone in his body and every instinct of his species screamed at him not to do. He chose surrender. Not because he was wise, not because he had found some late moment of enlightenment about the futility of war, but because he finally understood, in the deepest and most visceral way possible, what Siluun the Kathari had tried to tell the galaxy months earlier. Ago. That you could not beat this species because they did not stop. They did not ever stop. You could burn their worlds and kill their people, and they would mourn and they would grieve, and then they would get up and come at you again, harder than before, and they would keep coming until you broke or they did. And the terrible truth, the truth that Jacques could see now with the perfect clarity of total defeat, was that they did not break. They had never broken. Not once in their entire blood-soaked history had they ever truly broken. The Galactic Concord convened an emergency session to formalize the end of the war and to address the matter that every species in the galaxy now recognized could not be ignored any longer. What to do about humanity. Siluun delivered the final assessment, standing in the same chamber where she had tried to warn them all those months ago. And this time every being in the room listened with the kind of attention that only comes from fear. Humanity is not the strongest species in this galaxy, she said. They are not the fastest or the most intelligent or the most ancient. There are species here today who surpass them in every single one of those categories. But they are without question the most relentless life form any of us have ever encountered. They do not conquer, they survive, and everything that tries to prevent them from surviving learns the same lesson that the Velari have now learned. That there is no force in this galaxy more dangerous than a human being who has been given a reason to fight. Ambassador Okonkwo addressed the Concord for the last time. And he was not the same man who had stood in this chamber a year ago with his elegant smile and his careful diplomacy. He was harder now, tempered by war and loss, and the knowledge that the galaxy only respected you when it was afraid of you. His message was simple. Humanity did not want this war. Humanity would not start the next one. But if any species, any empire, any force in the galaxy ever again mistook human kindness for weakness, or human patience for submission, they would learn the same lesson the Velari had learned, and the tuition would be just as high. The chamber was silent, not the silence of indifference, the way it had been silent when Okonkwo had begged for help a lifetime ago, but the silence of understanding, the deep and permanent understanding that the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, and would never shift back. Humanity went home. They buried their dead, and they rebuilt their colonies, and they mourned Meridian 7 with a grief that would become a permanent part of their culture, a scar they would carry forward into the centuries, the way they carried all their scars, openly and without shame. They did not become conquerors. They did not build an empire. They did not do any of the things that the fearful species of the Concord had predicted they would do. They simply existed, and they made it very clear that they intended to keep existing, and they left the rest of the galaxy to draw its own conclusions. Centuries later, alien children across 1,000 worlds would ask their parents the same question, the way children always ask about the things that shaped the world they were born into. Why do the empires not fight anymore? They would ask. And the answer was always the same, spoken in 100 different languages by 100 different species, but always carrying the same weight and the same warning. Because the humans taught them what happens when they do.